At my own grandmother's will reading, my sister announced, without blinking, that I was officially cut out of the inheritance. No explanation, no warning, just erased. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a doctor, not a businesswoman like the rest of my family, and apparently, that made me disposable. But what none of them knew was that Grandma had left me something they couldn't touch. A secret key, and a letter that would flip everything upside down. Before we jump into the story, if you don't mind, let me know where you're from by leaving a comment below. That way, I can send a special hello your way. Now go ahead, grab yourself a warm cup of water, and find a comfy spot. It's time to begin the story. The envelope trembled slightly in Emily's hands, heavier than it should have been. The paper inside couldn't have weighed more than a few ounces, yet it felt as if it carried every unspoken word, every look of quiet understanding, and every ounce of love Margaret Anderson had ever offered her. Rain tapped softly against the window pane of her small Richmond apartment, the sound steady and patient. The lamp above the kitchen table cast a golden glow over the creased envelope, illuminating her name. Emily Grace Anderson, written in the familiar looping script that always made her think of holidays and warm pie crust. She hadn't seen that handwriting in over a month, not since Margaret had passed quietly in her sleep. Across from her, James cradled a chipped mug of black coffee. He didn't speak, just watched her with that steady, calm gaze of his. Emily knew he wouldn't push. He never did. She turned the envelope over again, thumb brushing along the edge. The seal, still intact, bore the faint imprint of her grandmother's initials. There had been no instructions beyond a single note left with her belongings. For Emily, open it when you're ready. She wasn't sure if she was ready now, but something about the evening, the weight in her chest, the stillness of the room, the way James had just happened to stop by, made her think perhaps she'd never be more ready than this. With a small, brittle crack, the seal broke. Inside was a single folded sheet of thick, cream-colored paper and a key. The key slipped easily into her palm, worn and cold, the kind of antique piece that could disappear into a pocket and never be seen again. But in that moment, it felt substantial, solid, like it had a story of its own. "What is it?" James asked quietly, leaning forward. Emily turned the key over. The metal was tarnished but smooth from years of handling. "A key," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "It looks old. I don't recognize it." Her heart pounded as she unfolded the letter. Her grandmother's handwriting bloomed across the page like a memory. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, then everything has happened as I feared. Your parents have chosen their path, and Lillian has followed it. But what none of them know is that I've seen it all, and I've made my own plans. This key opens a lockbox in my name at First Commonwealth Bank, Broad Street. Go alone. What you find there will change everything." Emily stared at the words. Her breath caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. Margaret had known. Not just about the favoritism, not just about the way Emily had always been the afterthought in family photos and holiday speeches. She had known something deeper, something that required action. The air in the apartment thickened, her pulse loud in her ears. For the first time in weeks, her grief wasn't just a dull, pressing ache. It surged forward, sharp and hot, burning behind her eyes. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to keep reading. She lowered the letter slowly, her fingers tightened around the key. "What did she say?" James asked gently. "She left me something," Emily murmured. "Something only I meant to find." The words, once spoken, hung in the air like mist, heavy, real, unavoidable. James reached across the table, placing his mug down. "Do you want me to go with you?" Emily shook her head. Number she said go alone. There was silence again. Not awkward, never with James, but thoughtful, respectful. Outside, the rain had softened into a quiet drizzle, a whisper of a storm. Emily slid the letter back into the envelope with care and tucked the key into her coat pocket. It rested there, pressing against her hip like a hidden promise. She stood, her chair scraping softly against the worn hardwood floor. "Be careful, Emily," James said as she reached the door, "and whatever you find, remember, it's yours, not theirs." She paused for just a moment, hand on the doorknob, her back to the room. Those words, so simple, settled deep into her bones. Then she stepped into the gray November mist, the key in her pocket, the hope in her chest, and the weight of everything unspoken finally starting to lift. What you find there will change everything. "Effective immediately," Lillian said. "Raymond and I will oversee the estate." The words echoed through the chandelier-lit hall like a gavel falling at the end of a trial. For a moment, everything in the grand Anderson dining room seemed to freeze. The clink of silverware, the rustle of linen napkins, the low hum of polite conversation. Then, as if nothing seismic had occurred, the buzz resumed. Laughter, applause, toasts. Emily sat near the far end of the table, a place she hadn't chosen but had been quietly directed to. Her glass of sparkling water trembled slightly in her hand as she tried to process what she had just heard. A Thanksgiving dinner, they'd called it, a celebration of family, legacy, and gratitude. But here, beneath the glow of antique sconces and surrounded by people she barely knew, it felt more like a coronation. Lillian stood with impeccable posture near the head of the table, a vision in ivory silk, her tone smooth and composed. Raymond, ever the politician, rested one hand on the back of her chair and smiled like he was already shaking hands with the future. Emily's father, seated beside them, beamed with pride. Her mother dabbed gently at the corners of her mouth with a cloth napkin and gave a small nod of approval, as if to say, "Finally." No one looked at Emily, not when Lillian announced that they would be leading all financial and property affairs of the family, not when the terms of Margaret Anderson's estate were casually summarized as already settled, and certainly not when Raymond joked about streamlining leadership to avoid unnecessary entanglements. Emily's heart thudded in her chest. Her fork lay untouched beside a half slice of turkey and a mound of stuffing she couldn't taste. She wanted to speak, to object, to ask questions, but her throat had closed up, words trapped behind a dam of disbelief. She caught her mother's eye across the table. There was no warmth there, only the same rehearsed smile she'd offered strangers in receiving lines. It was only when the toast ended and people returned to sipping wine and discussing holiday plans that Emily managed to stand, her chair scraping against the hardwood louder than she intended. A few heads turned. Lillian raised a single arched brow. "Excuse me," Emily said softly, not waiting for a response. She stepped through the hallway lined with family portraits, past generations framed in gold, all staring down with expressions of solemn pride. Not one of them looked like her. She slipped out the side door into the cold evening air. The sharp November wind bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed it. At least it made her feel something. The sky had turned the color of wet slate, clouds thick and unmoving. The driveway was dotted with sleek cars and murmurs from guests stepping outside to smoke or take calls. Emily kept walking, past them all, until she reached the edge of the estate's garden wall. She sat on a low stone bench beneath the bare branches of a sugar maple, her breath coming in shallow, fast gasps. She hadn't expected to be celebrated, but she hadn't expected erasure either. Not like this, not so publicly. She closed her eyes and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. They had made their choice. They always had. A voice echoed in her memory, soft, deliberate, familiar. "They won't see you, but I do." Her grandmother's words, whispered from a hospital bed only weeks before her death, resurfaced like a warm tide. Emily swallowed hard. She pulled her coat tighter around her and rose to her feet. Her legs felt heavy, like she was wading through mud. She didn't look back as she crossed the long, circular drive, passing parked cars and lanterns flickering against the dusk. Her car was cold when she slipped inside. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. James? She let it ring. What could she say? That she'd been disowned without a word? That her grandmother's life, her love, her memory, had just been reduced to an afterthought in someone else's victory speech? Number not yet. She drove home in silence, the tires humming against the road, headlights cutting through the mist. The city lights of Richmond shimmered in the distance, blurred by low clouds. Her apartment was dark when she entered, save for the amber glow of the lamp she always left on by the kitchen window. She hung her coat, set her keys in the bowl by the door, and collapsed into a kitchen chair. The envelope was still there, the one with her name in Margaret's handwriting. She reached for it slowly, brushing her fingers along the worn paper, and then, with a breath that shook her to the core, she remembered. The key, the one Margaret had trusted only her to use. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket and closed around it, cold, solid, and waiting. She had lost everything until she remembered the key. The Anderson building hadn't changed in decades, but today it felt like a different world. The carved limestone facade, once grand and imposing, now wore a coat of gentle neglect, like a dowager who had stopped dressing for company. Its brass nameplate still glinted in the cold December morning, though some of the letters had dulled with time. Margaret Anderson, founder, 1927. Emily stood on the sidewalk across the street, coat buttoned high, scarf wrapped tight against the wind. Her breath clouded in the air as she stared at the building she'd walked past 100 times and never really seen. Today, she would walk inside not as a visitor, but as someone with a claim, a purpose. Her fingers closed around the key in her pocket, solid, unassuming. Yet somehow, it hummed with significance. Inside, the bank's marble floors stretched out beneath ornate lighting fixtures, casting pale reflections beneath her boots. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and something older, paper, leather, time. A young woman in a navy blazer approached her at the front desk, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. "Good morning. How may I assist you?" Emily produced the letter she'd received from her grandmother, unfolded it, and pointed to the line that mentioned the lockbox. The woman's eyes scanned the note, and for a flicker of a second, something in her expression changed. Recognition, maybe, or surprise, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Right this way," she said, motioning down a quiet hallway. They passed oil portraits of past executives, all with the same steel-eyed expression and formal attire. At the end of the hall stood a heavy wooden door with a brass plaque, "Private Vault Access, Authorized Entry Only." The woman keyed in a code and opened the door. "You'll have full privacy. Please take your time." Emily nodded and stepped into the small room. The door clicked shut behind her with a muffled finality. The room was hushed. A rectangular table sat in the center, its surface unmarred. Along the far wall, a vault technician had already laid out a long, slender lockbox. Emily stared at it, her pulse loud in her ears. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the original key from her pocket and inserted it into the small lock. With a soft, metallic click, it opened. Inside, nestled carefully atop deep, burgundy felt, was a folder bound in leather and a small velvet pouch tied with a ribbon that had faded to gold gray. She reached for the pouch first. Her fingers brushed the velvet, slow and deliberate, as if she feared the moment would vanish if rushed. Untying the ribbon, she let it slip open. A key slid into her hand. Not like the first. This one was ornate with an engraved tag, "Anderson Building, Executive Suite." Her breath caught. She hadn't even known the building had such a key. Her family had always kept talk of the company's infrastructure close to the chest. She turned it over, feeling the etchings beneath her thumb. Real, heavy, intentional. Underneath, tucked neatly into the folder, was a letter in Margaret's handwriting. Dearest Emily, if you are holding this, then the time has come for you to know the truth. I have watched from the sidelines as your parents and Lillian shaped their own narrative, but I never agreed with their choices. I never stopped seeing you. The Anderson building, the very heart of our family's work, was never theirs to inherit by default. I held it in a separate trust, and now it is yours, entirely. This is not a burden. It is a foundation. You are the one I trust to honor what it was meant to be. Emily covered her mouth with one hand, her eyes burning. She had braced for something symbolic, a small gesture, a forgotten heirloom maybe. Not this, not the very structure her family had built their legacy upon. She kept reading. Within this folder, you will find all documentation, property deeds, trust ownership, and shares I retained in Anderson Financial Group. The building is yours outright. So is the leverage. What you do with it is up to you. You do not need their permission, Emily. You never did. She lowered the letter slowly. Her heart pounded, not from fear this time, but something wilder. Liberation, perhaps, or validation. She opened the folder. The documents were meticulously organized. Title transfers, bank trust forms, notarized statements from her grandmother's legal advisor. It was all real, irrefutable, legal, and deliberate. Beneath it all was a second letter, shorter, typed, signed by a woman named Diane Riley. Emily recognized the name instantly, her grandmother's financial advisor. The letter confirmed that Margaret had begun this process nearly 5 years earlier. There was even a line that made her laugh, albeit shakily. Margaret always said you wouldn't see this coming, but you'd know exactly what to do when it arrived. Emily sat down, folder still open in front of her, both hands resting on its edges. The room felt warmer now, or perhaps it was just her, no longer cold with uncertainty but burning with clarity. They had erased her from the will, but Margaret had handed her the blueprint to rebuild everything. She reached again for the ornate key. This one didn't tremble in her hand. It fit. She had the leverage, and now she had a plan. "We're here out of courtesy," Lillian said, "but make it quick." The words sliced through the polished air of the Anderson Financial Group boardroom, crisp and cold as the winter wind outside. Lillian's ivory suit, tailored to perfection, gleamed beneath the overhead lights. She sat with one leg crossed over the other, Raymond beside her, exuding practiced calm. But Emily could see it. The flicker in her sister's jaw, the subtle tightening of her hands. They weren't as composed as they appeared. Emily didn't flinch. She met Lillian's gaze with quiet steel, then looked across the table at her parents. Harold and Ellen Anderson were seated in their usual positions of command, but today they looked older, more brittle. Maybe it was the lighting, or maybe it was the weight of the unknown. To their right sat Walter Simmons, the family's longtime attorney. His expression was unreadable, but Emily sensed curiosity beneath the surface, perhaps even a hint of unease. "I appreciate you all taking the time," Emily said evenly, folding her hands atop the leather folder in front of her. "We're very busy," Raymond added, voice tight. "So unless this is about a grievance or a misunderstanding, I suggest we keep things efficient." "It won't take long," Emily replied, "but I do think you'll want to hear what I have to say." She opened the folder with deliberate care and slid the first document across the table, an original deed of ownership. Her father picked it up, frowning slightly as he scanned the top lines. Then his brow creased deeper. His eyes slowed. The color in his face shifted. "This is the Anderson building," he said slowly. "Yes," Emily said. "It's mine." Silence bloomed across the room, thick and instant. "That's absurd," Lillian scoffed. "You can't possibly believe—" "It was never owned by the company," Emily cut in. "Grandma held it in a separate trust, completely outside Anderson Financial Group. She passed it directly to me." Raymond leaned forward. Even if that were true, it has no bearing on company operations." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she slid the second document across the table, one bearing the company's own seal, notarized, signed, and stamped. It was the share agreement. "This does," she said. Margaret retained a controlling block of shares. Upon her passing, they were transferred to me. Walter adjusted his glasses, picked up the document, and read in silence. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You're bluffing," Lillian snapped. "Grandma wouldn't do that. She wouldn't give you that kind of power." Emily looked at her sister, not with anger, but with clarity. "She didn't give me power, Lillian. She gave me responsibility." Her mother finally spoke, her voice brittle. Why didn't you tell us?" Emily paused. For the first time in the meeting, emotion flickered behind her composure. "Because you never asked," she said simply. "Because none of you ever wondered if I had anything to say." Lillian laughed, a short, sharp sound. "So what now? And you want to take over? Demand some title? You think you can run a financial group because Grandma liked you?" "I don't want a title," Emily replied, "and I'm not here to tear anything down." She sat back slightly and let the room breathe. "You have two options," she continued. "You can buy out my shares at a fair, independent market valuation, or we restructure, equal governance, independent board oversight, shared leadership." Raymond leaned back, folding his arms. "That's blackmail." "No," Emily said. "It's accountability." Her father looked at Walter, who gave a slow, steady nod. "From a legal standpoint, her proposal is sound, fair, enforceable." The silence that followed stretched long and taut. Then Lillian leaned in, eyes sharp. "You think this makes you one of us?" Emily didn't blink. "Number, I think this means I was never out to begin with." She rose, gathering her folder. Her chair made no sound against the carpet. She looked around the table, at the parents who never saw her, the sister who dismissed her, the brother-in-law who saw her as an obstacle, and felt none of the old longing. Just resolve. They didn't have to like it. They didn't even have to understand it. They just had to live with it. "I'm not here for revenge," Emily said. "I'm here for balance." The silence at the family table had never been so loud. Emily sat across from her mother at a quiet brunch cafe, tucked into a side street of Richmond's historic district. A jazz trio played soft background music near the front window, and the scent of maple syrup mingled with fresh coffee. Despite the cozy ambiance, Emily could feel the tension wrapped around their table like plastic, clear, clinging, and suffocating. Ellen Anderson stirred her tea without looking up. Her earrings, small pearls Emily remembered from childhood, swayed with each precise motion. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," her mother said finally. "I have an hour," Emily replied. Ellen gave a small nod. "That's fair." It was the first time they'd spoken face-to-face since the boardroom, the same boardroom where Emily had upended everything they thought was settled. The conversation now meandered through neutral ground: weather, an upcoming charity event, a mutual acquaintance's retirement. Not once did her mother mention the company, or the building, or the shift in power that now required Emily's signature on every major decision. And Emily didn't bring it up either. Afterward, she walked back to her car alone, coat wrapped tightly around her. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. But underneath that fatigue was something stronger: clarity. There were some bridges that didn't need to be rebuilt. Later that week, she stood in the lobby of the Anderson building, clipboard in hand. Contractors moved past her carrying blueprints and paint samples. The building groaned and echoed with the sounds of renewal: hammering, sanding, the hum of fluorescent lights being replaced with soft, energy-efficient fixtures. Gone were the dusty offices locked for years. Gone were the outdated waiting rooms and forgotten filing cabinets. In their place, new beginnings were forming: shared workspaces, art studios, a tech startup with 3 eager founders and no budget. Emily had opened the doors to them all. "This place has soul," one of them told her. "You can feel it when you walk in." Emily smiled. It was built by someone who knew what that meant. She spent evenings with Diane, her grandmother's longtime financial advisor, going over the final contracts. The company had agreed, grudgingly but legally, to the new governance structure. Emily's role was now formal, her signature required, her voice expected. James stopped by on a cold Thursday with takeout and 2 cans of ginger ale. He found her at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and architectural sketches, highlighters strewn like confetti. "You know," he said, plopping into the seat across from her, "you used to talk about fixing that building when we were 19. She looked up, amused. "Did I?" "Right after you patched that broken handrail on the back stairs, you said, 'If I ever run this place, I'd make it feel like it belonged to people again.'" Emily leaned back, the memory surprising her. "I guess I forgot." James grinned. "You remembered just in time." By mid-December, the second floor was fully leased. A local literacy nonprofit moved into the old executive offices. The marble lobby gleamed again, not from grandeur, but from care. Margaret's brass plaque was polished to a soft shine. Emily stood alone one night in that lobby, coat draped over her arm, the low hum of new life reverberating through the floor. She tilted her head back and looked at the arched ceiling. The chandelier her grandmother had chosen decades ago flickered slightly, casting rings of light that danced across the stone. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about place, purpose, presence. She hadn't just reclaimed a legacy, she had rewritten it. The rooftop view stretched across Richmond like a map of second chances. Below, the city glowed in quiet golds and dusky blues, its streets still damp from a brief New Year's rain. The air was crisp, not biting, and the breeze carried the distant sound of a saxophone drifting up from a street performer somewhere near Broad Street. Emily stood alone at the edge, a soft scarf wrapped around her neck, hands cupped around a steaming mug of chamomile tea. The Anderson Building's rooftop had once been an unused relic, pigeon-stained concrete and rusted vents. Now it was a shared garden and common space, framed with string lights and potted evergreens, a place for new tenants to pause, to dream. Tonight, though, it was just hers. Somewhere below, a community potluck had wound down. Startups, artists, nonprofits, all the people who now called this place home, had celebrated the years close together in the newly renovated lobby, their voices rising like hope. Emily had stayed until the last tray of brownies disappeared and then quietly excused herself. She needed this moment, unshared, unspoken, real. James found her 10 minutes later, holding a takeout container in one hand and a can of ginger ale in the other. He didn't speak right away, just stood beside her, offering the ginger ale like a peace offering. She took it, smiled, and leaned slightly against the rooftop railing. "Not bad for someone who wasn't in the will," he said softly. She let out a breath of something like laughter. Not bad at all. They stood together for a few minutes, watching the sky shift from dusk to indigo. "My dad sent a letter," Emily said finally. James glanced at her. "And? I haven't opened it. Will you?" "Maybe, one day." She shrugged. "I'm not angry. I just don't need it to define me anymore." James nodded. "That's what makes you stronger than all of them." Emily didn't answer, but she thought of Margaret, of that first envelope, of the quiet faith that had been placed in her hands, not just in property or legal authority, but in legacy. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the edges of the paper cup she'd left on a bench behind her. Across the city, the bell tower chimed the hour, 9 p.m., ushering in the first calm hours of a brand new year. She turned to look through the windows lining the upper floor. Offices once shuttered were now lit with soft desk lamps and laughter. Ideas scribbled on whiteboards, framed photos placed on shelves, real life unfolding, her life. She hadn't fought for a seat at someone else's table. She had built her own and left the door open for others. The rooftop lights flickered gently overhead as she took a final sip of tea, her breath curling in the cool night. Her coat shifted slightly, and for a moment the glint of the old brass key still on her keychain caught the light. The legacy she built wasn't just inherited, it was chosen. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with a quiet decision to stop waiting for permission and start honoring your own worth. Emily didn't reclaim power to punish, but to preserve something deeper: dignity, memory, purpose. Because true legacy isn't built on inheritance, it's shaped by character, like the key passed from a quiet hand to a determined one. Kindness often unlocks doors that pride never could.